Here's a question that breaks most people's brains. The Federal Reserve prints money, trillions of dollars. They create it out of nothing. Just numbers on a computer screen, no gold backing it, no assets backing it. No one deposited anything. They just create it. In 2020 and 2021, the Federal Reserve created $6 trillion. $6 trillion out of thin air. They didn't mine it, they didn't earn it, they didn't borrow it from anyone. They just made it appear on a computer. But here's the problem. Every dollar bill in your wallet says Federal Reserve note at the top. A note is a debt instrument. It's a promise to pay. When you sign a promissory note for a car loan, you're promising to pay the bank back. That note represents debt, which means every dollar in existence is technically debt. Someone owes that dollar to someone else. So if the Federal Reserve creates dollars out of thin air, and those dollars are debt, who does the Federal Reserve owe the money to? Think about it. They created it from nothing. There was no lender, no one gave them money to lend out. They just made it appear. So who is the creditor? If dollars are debt instruments and the Fed created them, who does the Fed owe? The answer should be simple, but it's not. Because when you understand how this actually works, you realize the entire monetary system is designed to transfer wealth from you to private banks. Before we answer who the Fed owes money to, you need to understand what the Federal Reserve actually is. Because everything you think you know is probably wrong. Most Americans believe the Federal Reserve is part of the government, a government agency like the Treasury Department or the IRS. It's not. The Federal Reserve is a private banking cartel. It was created in 1913 by the Federal Reserve Act, and it was designed by bankers, for bankers, to give them control of the money supply. Here's the structure. The Federal Reserve System consists of 12 regional Federal Reserve banks: New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Boston, and 7 others. Each of these 12 banks is a private corporation, not government agencies, private corporations. They have shareholders, and those shareholders are private commercial banks. J.P. Chase owns shares of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So does Citibank, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley. The largest banks in America are literally shareholders in the Federal Reserve. They own it. Now there's also a board of governors in Washington, D.C., 7 governors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. This gives the appearance of government control, but it's an illusion. The board of governors sets policy, but the regional Federal Reserve banks, which are private, do the actual work. They create the money, they interact with banks, they hold the assets, and they're owned by private banks. Here's how it works. Every commercial bank that's part of the Federal Reserve System is required to buy shares in their regional Federal Reserve Bank. So J.P. Chase, because it's headquartered in New York, owns shares in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Those shares pay a dividend, 6% per year, guaranteed, risk-free. No matter what happens in the economy, member banks get a 6% return on their Federal Reserve shares. That's written into law. The Federal Reserve is legally required to pay private banks 6% annually before any profits go to the Treasury. So the Federal Reserve is a profit-making institution owned by private banks that pays dividends to those banks and has the power to create unlimited money. Let that sink in. A private banking cartel has the power to create money and charges the government interest on it. So how does the Fed actually create money? This is where it gets technical, but this is the key to understanding the scam. Here's the step-by-step process. Step 1, the United States government needs money. Let's say Congress passes a budget. They need to spend $5 trillion this year, but tax revenue is only $4 trillion. They have a $1 trillion deficit. They need to borrow $1 trillion. Step 2, the Treasury Department issues bonds. Treasury bonds are IOUs. The government is promising to pay back the money with interest. They issue $1 trillion in bonds and auction them off. Who buys them? Foreign governments, pension funds, mutual funds, banks, and the Federal Reserve. Step 3. The Federal Reserve decides to buy $500 billion of those bonds. This is called open market operations. Now here's the magic trick. Where does the Federal Reserve get $500 billion to buy these bonds? You'd think they have to have the money already, that they collected it from somewhere. Maybe taxes or deposits or profits. No, they don't have it. They create it out of nothing. Here's literally how it works. The Federal Reserve opens their computer system. They go to the Treasury's account. They type in $500 billion, and it appears. That's it. No gold was moved. No assets were sold. No one made a deposit. The Federal Reserve just credited the Treasury's account with $500 billion that didn't exist 1 second earlier. They created it by typing numbers into a computer. The Treasury now has $500 billion to spend. That money enters circulation. Government contractors get paid, federal employees get salaries, programs get funded. The dollars flow into the economy. But the government now owes the Federal Reserve $500 billion plus interest. Let's say 3% interest, that's $15 billion per year. So the Federal Reserve created $500 billion from nothing, zero cost to them. And now the government, meaning taxpayers, pays them $15 billion per year in interest, forever, or until the bond matures and gets refinanced with another bond. And this is how money is created in the modern system. The Federal Reserve creates it from nothing and lends it to the government at interest. So who actually owns the Federal Reserve? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented fact. You can look up the shareholders. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is the most powerful of the 12 regional Fed banks because it handles all open market operations, is owned by member banks. The largest shareholders are JP Morgan Chase Citibank, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley Bank of America. These banks own shares in the New York Fed. They're not just customers, they're owners, and as owners, they have power. Each regional Federal Reserve Bank has a board of 9 directors. 6 of those directors are elected by the member banks. The other 3 are appointed by the Board of Governors. So private banks elect 2/3 of the directors of their regional Fed bank. Those directors choose the president of the regional Fed bank, and the presidents of the regional Fed banks sit on the Federal Open Market Committee, the committee that decides monetary policy. So private banks have direct influence over monetary policy through the directors they elect. It's a circular system designed to give banks control while maintaining the appearance of government oversight. Now, the Federal Reserve's ownership structure is intentionally opaque. They don't publish a list of shareholders and how many shares each bank owns, but we know the largest banks are the largest shareholders because of their size and their representation on the boards, and we know they profit. The Federal Reserve is required by law to pay member banks a 6% annual dividend on their shares. In 2023, the Federal Reserve paid member banks roughly $2 billion in dividends. But here's what most people don't understand, that $2 billion came from interest on the bonds the Fed holds. Bonds they bought with money they created from nothing. So the Federal Reserve creates money, uses it to buy government bonds, collects interest on those bonds, pays themselves and their member banks first, and then sends the leftovers to the Treasury. It's a brilliant scam. They profit from creating money that costs them nothing to create, and the government, meaning taxpayers, pays them interest forever. Let's trace the money from creation to profit and see exactly how wealth is transferred from taxpayers to banks. Step 1. The Federal Reserve creates $500 billion out of nothing, zero cost to them. Step 2. They use that $500 billion to buy Treasury bonds. The government gets $500 billion to spend. Step 3. That money circulates in the economy. People get paid, businesses get contracts, the economy functions. Step 4. But the government now owes $500 billion plus interest to the Federal Reserve. Let's say 3% interest, that's $15 billion per year. Where does the government get $15 billion to pay the interest? Tax revenue, income tax, payroll tax, corporate tax. Every year, over $1 trillion of federal tax revenue goes to paying interest on the national debt. That's money that could go to infrastructure, healthcare, education. Instead, it goes to interest payments, and a portion of those interest payments go to the Federal Reserve. In 2023, the Federal Reserve held about $5 trillion in Treasury bonds on their balance sheet. At an average interest rate of around 3%, that's $150 billion in interest income per year. The Federal Reserve collects $150 billion per year in interest from the government on bonds they bought with money they created from nothing. What do they do with that money? First, pay operating expenses, salaries, buildings, operations, about $5 billion per year. Second, pay the 6% dividend to member banks, about $2 billion per year. Third, keep some as surplus capital. Fourth, send the rest to the Treasury. In 2023, they sent about $76 billion to the Treasury, but they collected $150 billion in interest. They kept about $74 billion for expenses, capital, and bank dividends. Here's the kicker. That interest is paid from your taxes. You work, you earn money. The government takes a portion in taxes. That tax money goes to the Treasury. The Treasury uses it to pay interest to the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve profits, and the member banks that own the Federal Reserve get their dividends, so money flows from your paycheck through the government to the Federal Reserve and ultimately to private banks. That's the wealth transfer. You work, banks profit. And the mechanism is the Federal Reserve's ability to create money and charge interest on it. Now here's the part that will truly blow your mind. The national debt can never be repaid, not because politicians are irresponsible, not because we spend too much, but because the monetary system is designed to require permanent debt. Let me explain the math. Every single dollar in existence was created by the Federal Reserve buying debt, mostly government debt. When the Fed buys a treasury bond, they create dollars. Those dollars enter circulation. That's how dollars are created, which means every dollar in existence represents debt that someone owes to the Federal Reserve. If you add up all the dollars in circulation, that number roughly equals the total debt owed to the Federal Reserve. Now imagine the government decided to pay off the entire national debt. They would have to collect dollars through taxes. They would take those dollars and give them back to the Federal Reserve to pay off the bonds. The Federal Reserve would receive the dollars and cancel the bonds. But here's the problem. When the Federal Reserve receives dollars in payment of debt, those dollars are destroyed. They disappear from the money supply. Because remember, dollars were created when the Fed bought the bonds. Paying off the bonds reverses the transaction. The dollars cease to exist. So if the government paid off the entire national debt, every dollar in circulation would be returned to the Fed and destroyed. The money supply would go to zero. There would be no money left in the economy. No dollars to pay workers, no dollars to buy goods, no dollars in bank accounts. The economy would collapse instantly. This is why the national debt has increased every single year since 1913, except for brief periods. The debt cannot decrease because the money supply cannot decrease without causing economic collapse. As the economy grows, you need more money in circulation. The only way to create more money in this system is for the government to borrow more from the Federal Reserve, which creates more debt. The system is designed to require perpetually increasing debt. It's not a bug, it's the core feature. But it gets even worse. The interest on the debt is not created when the loan is made. Let me explain. The Federal Reserve creates $500 billion and lends it to the government. The government owes $500 billion plus 3% interest. Let's say that's $15 billion per year, but only $500 billion was created. The $15 billion in interest was not created. So where does the $15 billion come from? It has to come from dollars that already exist in circulation, which means someone else has to go into debt to create those dollars. Or the government has to borrow even more, which creates more interest, which requires more borrowing. It's an exponential trap. Every time money is created, more debt is created than money. If the Fed creates $500 billion in principal, but the government owes $515 billion including interest, there's a $15 billion shortfall. That shortfall can only be filled by creating more debt, which creates more interest, which creates a larger shortfall. The debt grows faster than the money supply because interest is not created with principal. This is why the national debt is $36 trillion and growing by over $2 trillion per year, even though we collect nearly $5 trillion in taxes. The math doesn't work. It's not designed to work. The system is designed to create unpayable debt that generates perpetual interest payments. and every dollar of interest paid is a transfer of wealth from taxpayers to the Federal Reserve and the banks that own it. A few presidents have understood this system and tried to stop it. They didn't end well. Andrew Jackson, in 1835, Andrew Jackson paid off the entire national debt, the only president to ever do so. How? He refused to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States, which was the central bank at the time. He called it a den of vipers and corruption. He vetoed its recharter. The bank ceased to exist. Without a central bank creating debt-based money, Jackson was able to pay off the national debt. For a brief moment, America had zero national debt. But what happened next? The Panic of 1837, a massive economic depression. Why? Because without new debt being created, the money supply contracted. The economy collapsed. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, Lincoln issued greenback, debt-free currency printed directly by the government, not borrowed from banks. $450 million in greenbacks were created to fund the war effort without going into debt to bankers. Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. James Garfield spoke publicly about the danger of private control of money. He said, "Whoever controls the money supply controls the nation." He was assassinated within months of taking office in 1881. John F. Kennedy. In 1963, Kennedy signed Executive Order 11,110, which authorized the Treasury to issue silver certificates backed by silver, bypassing the Federal Reserve. Kennedy wanted to return to a system where the government could create money directly without borrowing it from the Fed. $4 billion in United States notes were printed. They said United States note instead of Federal Reserve note. They were debt-free money created by the government, not the Fed. 5 months later, Kennedy was assassinated. Lyndon Johnson became president. One of his first acts was to halt the issuance of United States notes. The $4 billion that had been printed were quietly removed from circulation. We went back to Federal Reserve notes exclusively. Now, I'm not saying these assassinations were because of their stance on central banking. That would be speculation. But it's historical fact that every president who seriously challenged the Federal Reserve's power either faced economic crisis or met a violent end, and the Federal Reserve's power remained intact. So, what can you do when the entire monetary system is designed to extract wealth from workers and transfer it to banks? First, understand your position in the system. Every dollar you hold is a Federal Reserve note, a debt instrument. You're holding evidence of someone else's debt. That debt loses value over time through inflation, which is how the Fed manages the debt burden. Second, recognize that cash savings lose value by design. The Federal Reserve targets 2% inflation officially, meaning they intentionally devalue the currency by 2% per year. Your savings lose purchasing power while the system extracts wealth. Third, assets outside the debt-based system hold value better. Real estate, productive businesses, commodities, skills. These can't be created from nothing by typing numbers into a computer. They have intrinsic value independent of the monetary system. Fourth, understanding the system changes how you interact with it. Debt can be a tool rather than a trap if you understand that the currency is being devalued by design. Fixed-rate debt gets inflated away while tangible assets hold value. Fifth, financial education becomes critical. The system depends on people not understanding it. Once you understand how money is created, who profits from it, and how wealth is transferred, you can position yourself accordingly. This isn't financial advice, it's pattern recognition. The Federal Reserve was designed to benefit banks at the expense of everyone else. That's not conspiracy, it's documented history and current law. So let's answer the original question. If the Federal Reserve prints money out of thin air, who do they owe it to? The answer is no one. The Federal Reserve creates money from nothing. There is no lender, there is no creditor. They don't owe the money to anyone. They are the ultimate source of dollars. But the government owes the money to the Federal Reserve. That's the trick. The Fed creates dollars by buying government bonds. When they buy a bond, they create the dollars to pay for it. The government receives the dollars, but the government now owes the Federal Reserve the principal plus interest, and the Federal Reserve is owned by private banks. So the chain of debt goes like this. The Federal Reserve, owned by private banks, creates money from nothing and lends it to the government. The government owes the Fed, and the government pays interest from tax revenue. Your tax dollars pay interest to a private banking cartel on money that was created from nothing. The Federal Reserve doesn't owe anyone, but everyone owes the Federal Reserve. Every dollar in your wallet is a Federal Reserve note, a debt instrument. You're holding evidence of debt that the government owes to private banks, and that debt can never be fully repaid because if it was, there would be no money. The system is designed to require permanent, exponentially growing debt, which generates permanent interest payments which transfer wealth from taxpayers to banks. For over 100 years, since 1913, this system has been operating. Trillions of dollars have been transferred from the American people to the banking system through this mechanism. And most people have no idea the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was the greatest transfer of power in American history. It transferred the power to create money from the government to private banks and gave those banks the legal right to profit from it forever. If this gave you a different perspective, subscribe. Because understanding the Federal Reserve is understanding who really runs America. It's not the president, it's not Congress, it's the banks, the ones who own the money printer. They create the money, they collect the interest, and you pay the debt. The Federal Reserve doesn't owe anyone, but the real question is, who owns the Fed? And the answer is the same banks that crashed the economy in 2008, the same banks that got bailed out with trillions in created money, the same banks that profit from every dollar of national debt. They own the system, and the system is designed to transfer wealth from you to them forever.